Okay, well, Becky, you want to start and then I'll talk for just a second about how registration went this month.
Very good. Well, welcome. This is Kansas Honey Producers program, extracting more money, more dollars from your hives. And tonight's speaker is Kristi Sanderson, and she's going to talk about making splits or nucs, or however you want to think about that, because if hives are doing well, they need to be managed and they need to be divided. And so that means you can make 2 or 3 out of 1, depending upon how big it is. Kristi's going to talk about that. This is put on for free by the Kansas Honey Producers. We did this in a way to keep in touch and to help people find more things to do with their hives. We hope you will consider joining us. The Kansas Honey Producers meeting is in March, our next meeting in Salina. You can find information on our website, which is kansashoneyproducers.org, one big long word. Look it up and check us out. It would be fun to see you all in Salina. It was mentioned as we were visiting a couple of minutes ago, the Northeast Kansas beekeepers are about to have a beginning beekeeping class. You could also find it online, nekba.org. So lots of opportunities for learning here in the next couple of months. So that's all I have. Thanks for coming, and go Joey.
Okay, I just want to say a few things. So we have exceeded our 500 people limit on this program. And so what we're going to do for next month is remove the names who are in there, put them in a spreadsheet, and future emails to this group to everyone who's already signed up will probably come from me, but it'll be the link, and we'll actually be able to give you more information about the talks than we've been able to. And we'll be able to promote our Kansas Honey Producers a little bit more if we do it that way. So I know a couple of you got a notice that you'd been canceled for tonight's talk, and we were able to send you another link and that sort of thing. So we apologize for that, but so Sammy, my sister, took 20 names off. And so if you were one of those that had an issue with Facebook, I apologize, but who would have thunk that we would have had these programs for this many months and had over 500 people sign up for them. So anyway, so we're just so glad Kristi's going to do this. She just makes the best nucs around, and she's a great speaker, clear and concise. And if you have questions, you can put them in the question box, the chat box, and we'll make sure and ask her those questions at the end. So that's it.
All right. Well, thanks, Jolie and Becky. Let's see if I can get my screen shared. All right. So let me fix my screen so I can see my slides a little better. Okay, so we're going to talk about making nucs and selling them. Obviously, this is a way you can generate more money from your hives. And the terms nucs or splits, those are interchangeable terms. I might mix them up sometimes, but I think for the most part, I call it a nuc instead of a split. So especially if you're really wanting to produce lots of nucs to generate income, and you're wanting to really get those bees revved up, you want to start feeding sugar water, a 1-to-1 ratio by weight. Once your daytime temperatures reach 50 degrees, that way it'll stimulate the bees more, and that will in turn allow the queen to lay out as much as possible based on weather conditions such as nighttime temperatures. Also, in your area, if there's not a good pollen flow going on, late February, early March, probably late February is a little early, but definitely in March, you might want to consider a supplement. And I I would recommend using a protein patty. Don't use anything with pollen in it because that can definitely spread disease. But here in the eastern part of Kansas, we do get a good pollen flow early. Pictured in the pictures below are an elm bud, which is on the left side, and then a maple tree that's in full bloom. As you can see, the flowers come out first, and they come out early when we get a nice warm day. Even before the leaves come out on the trees, the buds will be there, and the bees can get lots of pollen from those flowers. If you're wanting to make nucs as early as possible, you'll want to purchase mated queens. Right now is the time when you need to start getting on people's lists to order those queens, especially if you're wanting even 10 queens. The earlier you can get on a supplier's list, the better. If you're going to raise your own queens, you're not going to be able to have your nucs as early in this part of the state or this part of the country. So I do recommend ordering from like California, Georgia, or a couple of places to order from, a couple states. And then make sure your supplier is going to deliver those by a next day service. You don't want those queens being banged around in the postal service system, and you want them out of that system as soon as possible. You don't want them to get too hot or too cold. So the sooner they get in your hands from your queen breeder's hands, the better. And then especially if you're getting a battery box, like what's pictured in the middle on the bottom, which a battery box is queens in individual cages, and then there's bees running around inside that box as attendants to take care of that whole group of queens. But you're going to want to check the food. Usually there's some type of sugar cake in there. It's usually inside of a plastic bag with a slit. And then there's also usually a sponge or a real thick wad of paper towels that are layered that have had water put on them. So be sure and check that battery box to make sure there's still food in there, and especially to make sure that those paper towels or sponges are still wet. If you're just getting a few queens like in the other picture, they usually come glued or stapled to a piece of cardboard inside of the shipping carton, and they usually punch holes in it for ventilation. And then they come with a candy plug in them. You're going to want to water those as soon as you get them. And the best way to do that is to stick your finger in some tap water that's room temperature, and then just place your finger on the surface of that cage where the screen is so the bees can get to that droplet of water. If you're getting a lot of queens, you might have to bank them if you're going to have to keep them for any amount of time. I don't like to keep queens even in a battery box for more than a week. And if they come with attendants in them, like if you get them other than in a battery box, you're going to want to remove all the attendants from those queen cages. And the simplest way I found to do that is to have an empty cage with no bees in it, and then my cage with the queen and the attendants in it. Take the cork out where there's no candy and line up those holes and let the bees march over to one side. Hopefully the attendants will march over before the queen does, but when there's a few attendants in that cage that started out with no bees, I put my finger over the hole with the cage of the queen and shake the attendants out. And I keep up that process until I have that queen in the cage by herself. And once you've got all of your queens in a frame, like you see in the middle picture where it holds those cages securely, you'll put that down inside your, I like to use a nuc box. You can use a hive body, but the most important thing is you want that nuc to be queenless. You don't want to have a laying queen in there on any of those frames. And then I'll have a frame of honey, so they have ample food right in that box. And then I like to find 2 frames with brood on on them that's emerging, and I place those frames of brood, one on either side of the frame that has all the queens and the cages in it. The reason you like to have emerging brood is so you have those young nurse bees, and they will be more attentive to the queens in the cages and be better at feeding them. If you have open brood or even real young larvae in there, a lot of times they pay more attention to that young larva. And then sometimes I've seen it where they've tried to raise a queen cell. So just, I mean, you've got a lot of money sitting in that nuc box. So it's best just to keep as much sealed brood in it as possible. So now I'm gonna tell you how I make my splits. And basically what I do is I start out with a bee yard where I have, anywhere from usually 4 to 8 hives in a yard. And I just start at the first hive in the line, and I'm going to separate my brood boxes. I do that immediately after smoking the hive. I don't give the hive a ton of smoke because I don't want to start the bees running around a lot. But I'll take the brood box that's on the top. I'll usually set it on the top cover that I've turned upside down. That way it's not setting directly on the grass. And that way the queen is isolated to one box or the other. A lot of times if you leave those boxes stacked up and you go through the top box, you're just going to chase the queen down to the bottom box. I go through frame by frame and start with the frame that's closest to me, which is usually either an empty frame with nothing in it or it's a frame of food. But I still take a glance at that frame because I need to find the queen, because I want to make sure I leave that queen behind in this parent colony once I'm done taking all the brood from it that I'm going to take. And I'm just real systematic about it. I start with that first frame and I go through all 10. And as I'm evaluating the brood, I'm also keeping my eye out for the queen. When I come to a frame that has some emerging brood, I kind of take a second glance because a lot of times that's where you find the queen, is on a frame that has emerging brood. And another thing I do is I keep either a paint marking pen or a Sharpie in my hand. And when I come to my first frame in the brood nest, I'll put some kind of dot or X on that frame so that when I go back to take brood from this hive, I know that that's where my brood frames have started in the box that I'm in. I've tried many different ways to isolate the queen once I've found her. The best method I found, and I really stuck on this method right now, is I use a queen clip. I just keep it in the pocket of my bee jacket. And once I find her, I insert her in the clip. You pinch the top of it and it opens up. I insert her down inside of it and then release it, and it comes back together. And then I'll take it and just set the queen clip in between 2 frames that are spread apart a little bit. That way she's down in amongst the bees. She's out of the sun where she can't get cooked. She's not sitting somewhere like in another box on a frame that I might accidentally kick over. And then I also like how the bees can walk through the clip. The material on the queen clip is the same spacing as a queen excluder, so the workers can come and go through that queen clip and tend to her if she needs tending to. Once I've gone through all 20 frames in my hive, and I'm assuming that we're working with a 2 deep hive body hive, I take away the brood that I'm going to take away and then put it in another box, and I'll show you a little bit later how I do that. But the brood that I'm leaving in this hive, I set in the bottom box in the middle. Typically, I end up leaving 6 to 8 physical frames with brood on them. And once I've got those down in the bottom box in the center, I put honey on the 2 very outside frames, and I try and fill in with frames between the honey and the brood that are mostly open comb. And then I'll put my second hive body on, and if I have any empty drawn frames with me, I'll use those first. If not, I'll use frames of foundation. One thing I do always try and do in that top box is on the two outside sides of the box, I put either a drawn comb or comb that's all honey. When you put foundation out there, you really have to be careful because you'll have to make sure you go back later and check it, and you'll probably have to rotate it more toward the middle because the bees just don't like drawing the comb out on those outside frames. This is my general rule of thumb that I use when I'm going through a hive. If it's before April 15, I leave 3 full frames of brood behind in that parent colony. If it's after April 15, I leave 4 full frames of brood. Now, what I mean by a frame of brood is it has to be top to bottom and corner to corner on both sides. And brood is everything from egg to open larva to sealed brood. So obviously, every frame of brood isn't going to be corner to corner, top to bottom, both sides. So you're going to have to do a little bit of adding in your head, or just pay attention. Maybe this frame only is a third full and this frame's a quarter full. You're going to just have to kind of make some judgment calls and really pay attention to the eggs. Sometimes you don't notice the eggs right away, and you might be leaving too much brood behind in a hive. So, you might be leaving, if you're leaving 3 full frames of brood behind after you've made your split, you're leaving it in your bottom box. That might be 4 or 5 physical frames that you're leaving in that bottom box. And so when I make my splits, it's not about how many splits can I get from this hive. It's more about I'm equalizing all my hives based on the time that I'm doing it. So some hives, you may only get 1 frame of brood from it, and other hives you may get 6 or 8 depending on how strong your hives are. When I'm collecting frames of brood from hives, one thing you have to be conscious about is the temperature. When you're packing a lot of bees and it's all frames of brood into a hive body, that can overheat pretty quick. So some things I do to help with this are I make some screened tops and bottoms. You'll notice this screen right here, it's more of a top screen because there's no legs, so to speak, underneath it, or no risers. If this were on the bottom, you'd want to put something that would elevate it slightly, because if it's in the back of your pickup, that screen's going to be sitting directly on your pickup bed. Another thing I do to help with so the brood doesn't overheat is instead of, just because a hive body holds 10 frames, I don't stick 10 frames in it. I'm definitely, the most I'll stick in is 9, and sometimes I'll only stick in 8. And that allows for space in between the frames. So it gives the bees more room to help keep that brood cool. And then another thing you want to be conscious of is how cool are the nights getting? Because, some spring days at the end of March and early April, we can still have some pretty cool nights. So make sure you collect enough bees from your parent colonies to ensure that that brood's going to be adequately covered during the nighttime when our temperatures fall. So if I've taken the frames of brood away and I look at it and I go, oh, that's not enough bees, I'll take another frame of brood that I know I'm going to leave behind, and I'll shake the bees off of that frame into the box of bees and brood that I've collected. And that's easy to do since we know where our queen is. We know she's isolated in that queen clip. If you're going to make a lot of nucs, you might want to consider making a special nuc yard. And when you make your nucs, you want to make them at least 3 miles away. You don't want those bees flying back to the parent colonies, especially if you have some field force bees, they're going to want to fly back to where they came from. So have your nukes 3 miles away. And, you know, it doesn't have to, if you're making a nuke yard, and unfortunately my backyard ends up being my nuke yard, but you can set down some pallets, you know, do something relatively simple, because it's just temporary, and you can space them pretty close together, especially if it's, you know, they're going to be gone in less than a month. And if, let's say you don't have another place to set up a designated nuke yard, another thing that I used to do was, since I have several different locations where I keep bees, I would gather bees and brood from the first bee yard I went to, and then go to the second bee yard on my route, make my splits with the bees and brood I had collected from the first bee yard, and then go through the hives, the parent colonies in that second bee yard, go to my third bee yard, and just kind of make my route. That's another thing you can do, just to ensure you're getting them farther from the parent colonies. Some things you want to take into consideration is that you're going to make several trips to take care of these nukes. So have them in a place that they're convenient and easy to get to. You're going to need to keep them fed, and you're going to be going back and releasing a queen, and you're going to be checking to make sure the queen's accepted. So make sure you have them accessible for all the trips that you're going to be making back to take care of them. So in your nuke box, the first and most important thing you want is your young mated queen. I like to try and find a frame of pollen if possible, and a frame of honey. So if I come across a hive that has extra frames of honey in it, they didn't go through much of their honey, and they're going to need room anyway because, you know, the queen has started to lay, I'll pull a few frames of those extra frames of honey from a parent hive. And if I see some pollen frames that are in excess in a parent colony, I might take one of those. Sometimes you can find some good pollen frames with brood on them, because as we all know, they put that band of pollen around the brood. Make sure you get some of that good fresh pollen in your nukes. And when I make up my nukes, I use that same rule of thumb as I did on my parent colonies, what I left behind, only now in the nuke box, I want the equivalent to 3 or 4 frames of full frames of brood based on if it's before or after April 15th. And the way I always make my nukes is I use 2 to 3 frames of brood of varying ages. Some people like to use all sealed brood, or as much as possible. I like to have where there's all ages of brood in my nuke box. Queen acceptance is the name of the game with nukes. I feel, you know, you want to get that first queen that you introduce to be accepted. So I always feed them sugar water again. And a reason I like to have a designated nuke yard is I tend to use entrance feeders with quart jars to feed my nukes, and those just don't do as well if you're in a yard with parent colonies as well. But giving them that sugar water helps with your acceptance. I never let the bees release the queens themselves. I always leave my queen caged 3 to 5 days, and then I go back and physically release her. But before I physically release my queen, I always look for queen cells that the bees have started for one reason or another, and they might be like they're shown in this upper picture on the right, you know, just the queen cup that they've built around a larva, kind of an emergency type situation. And I scan the frames of brood for those, and just take my hive tool and knock them off before I release the queen. And then also before I release my queen, I look at the cage and I see how the bees are acting toward the queen. if they're just kind of walking around, sticking their tongues through that screen wire and touching her and feed her, and I can just take my finger and gently brush the bees aside, then that's a good indication everything's good. But if you see something like pictured in the lower picture, if you look at those bees, you know, they've got their abdomens pointed down, trying to sting the cage. And they were actually grabbing onto the screen wire with their mandibles, pulling at it. So obviously, when I found this, they were not accepting that queen. So after I've released my queen, I go back 5 to 7 days later and I look to see if she's been accepted. And once again, I'm going to look for queen cells. And if I missed any of those little emergency type queen cells, they'll now be capped over and kind of on the face of the frame. They're a lot easier to find. And a lot of times, you know, I'll take my hive tool or the back of my hand where my fingernails are and kind of scrape over the back of the bees just to see the brood clearly, to make sure I don't see any of these queen cells like this. Because all it takes is one of those virgin queens to emerge, and then you've just lost your purchased mated queen that you have in there. As I'm looking for those queen cells, I look for eggs. Eggs is a great indication that your queen's been accepted and laying. And then also I look for my queen at this time. If everything looks good, and she seems to be walking calmly on the frames, I go ahead and mark her at this time. And sometimes it seems that a young, newly laying mated queen is a little bit harder to find. As you'll notice in the picture below, it took me forever to find this queen in a nuc one time, and I think it was because she always had her head poked in a cell, and you know, she just didn't look right, so my eye didn't catch her. So, you know, all you can see is her abdomen poking out there as she's looking down and measuring the inside of that cell. So what do you do if there's no evidence of a queen in your hive when you're going back and checking? One of the first things I do is I look and I listen for a virgin queen. A virgin queen does piping, which is a real shrill kind of peeping noise. It's kind of like beep, 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 beep. And she's smashing her body to the comb and vibrating, and that's what makes that noise. Virgin queens are harder to find, a lot harder. The bees aren't attracted to her to groom her. In fact, a lot of times they just completely ignore her. She's running around on the face of the comb. She's pretty erratic, and as you can see in the picture, she's also a lot smaller because she's not all plumped up and mature after she's been mated. A lot of times you'll hear people say, you can judge the temperament of a hive to know if they're queenless or not. Sometimes that's pretty tough with a nuc. I don't rely on that. It seems like they can be queenless, and for some reason, I think it's because they're smaller, their temperament, they just don't get that aggressive tendency and that deeper buzz. So I really don't rely on that too much. One of the best ways I've found to see if it's queen right or not, or if it has a virgin queen in there, maybe be a better way to say it, is I take a frame that has eggs on it and young larvae and see if queen cells are started. I don't want to introduce another queen right away, because if I've got a virgin queen running around in there, I've just thrown another $30–40 into that hive. So if I throw a frame of brood on there that has some eggs and some young larvae, and they don't start raising any queens on it, then I've more than likely got a virgin queen running around in there. If they do start queen cells on that, then I've got a queenless hive, and I would go ahead and introduce another queen. Record keeping is real important when you're making several nucs. This is how I've come up to do with it. I use a paint pen, something that you can purchase at a Hobby Lobby or a Home Depot. And I just write on the lids of my nucs. And this is actually one that I went and found and took a picture of. And you can see it's got several years worth of writing on it. But kind of some of my symbols are, if it has an RQ on the lid, that means I need to requeen that hive. For some reason, maybe the hive didn't take, or the queen didn't take. If it has an LQ on it, like you can see on this lid, you can see LQ 513. That means I inspected that hive on the 13th of May and the queen's laying in it. Once I'm confident that everything's good, I put an X on them, and then I know that nuc's ready to sell. Sometimes I'll write the type of queen that I have in that hive. I use 2 or 3 different sources a lot of times to get queens from. And you can see real faintly in white, there's an RI, which I remember several years ago, I got some Rossman Italians. So it's kind of a crude record keeping method, but it lets me know what's going on into the hive. And a lot of times I'll start with putting on the date that I put the queen cage in the hive. It doesn't show that on this lid, but let's say I put the queen in there on April 3rd, it would say 4-3. And then I would go back and let's say 3 days later, I would put an R4-7. I would know I released it on the 7th. And that's, you can look at the lid real quick and know what's going on or what you've done with that nuc to that point. Some things that you want to consider before you sell nucs is, are you going to do a frame exchange? Personally, I don't do a frame exchange because you never know what you're going to get back. I like 10 nails in my frames, 4 in the top, 4 in the bottom, and then 2 into each top bar from the end. So I'm pretty picky about how my frames are. You never know if you're going to get something that's new or old. And I just feel like it's easier to charge for the cost of the nuc and rather than doing a frame exchange. Something else you want to take into account is equipment. Do you have nuc boxes on hand that you can use? Because keep in mind, you might have to transport these once they're ready to go. So I would really recommend using some type of nuc box, whether you buy cardboard ones or you buy wooden ones that you paint and put together. Also, another thing you can do is when you're selling your nucs, you could have the recipient bring you their equipment and make up the nuc directly into their hive body. But keep in mind, that's a hive body that potentially you're going to have to use a ratcheting strap to keep it all together. The thing I like about nuc boxes is when you pick them up, or at least my nuc boxes, when I pick them up, the bottoms are fastened to the body part and I don't have to worry about anything falling apart. How much are you going to charge for your nucs? Take into consideration, the equipment you're going to have to replace, the queen, the time that it takes to get the queen laying and everything. And then, are you going to require a deposit? Personally, I don't require a deposit. It's just something else to have to deal with. And honestly, if right now in this day and age, if someone doesn't want their nuc, when you call them up and tell them it's ready, there's always somebody standing in line that wants one. And then, are you going to make 4 or 5 frame nucs? Some people make 4 frame nucs, some people make 5 frame nucs. But when you do your advertising, or make sure you let the customer know, what they're getting, how many frames of brood, is there a food frame in there? I like to tell customers that there's going to be everything in there from emerging brood to eggs. That's how I sell my nucs. And then try and give an approximate date when they'll be ready. I mean, it's hard to do. I mean, sometimes conditions are beyond our control, especially weather, but have a delivery date in mind when they can be picked up or delivered. And then you'll have to make delivery and pickup arrangements. And then the big thing is don't overpromise. Probably my second or third year when I made Nucs, I was young and full of energy, or a lot younger. I way overpromised for the amount of time I had, and was spending time in the bee yard, trying to get things ready for people, and trying to come up with a good quality product. So don't overpromise, because things can go really bad really fast. Plus, that's a mark on your integrity and your product, and you want to deliver as good a product as possible. Very rarely do I ever deliver a nuc. I always arrange pickup times for the customer to come to me, and I either do it at dawn or dusk. Either one of them is perfectly fine. I want to do it when most of the bees are home so that the customer gets the full nuc. And then, you're going to be more than likely transferring these bees out of your nuc box into their equipment. So I lightly smoke the bees. I don't want to get them running around a whole bunch like you can do sometimes when you use a lot of smoke. And I like to show them what's in their nuc box. We'll go through all the frames. I'll point out all the different ages of brood. If it's a young new beekeeper, I'll make sure they know the difference between a worker and a drone. And then no matter who it is, whether they're a seasoned beekeeper or a new beekeeper, I always find the queen when I'm transferring the frames over. I want to be 100% sure that they're getting the queen. That's the most important thing of a beehive. So if I have to, I'll go through the frames again once it's transferred over into their equipment. I remember one time someone came to get a nuc from me and just could not find the queen. We'd probably gone through these frames about 5 times. And finally I thought, I wonder if she's in the feeder. At that time I was using division board feeders, and sure enough, I pulled out the feeder and looked in there, and there was the queen walking around inside the feeder. So if I'd have said, oh, I'm sure she's in here somewhere on these frames, that guy would have potentially gone home without the queen in his hive. So, I just really stress finding that queen for your customer when they come. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. It's how I do it. So if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Hey, Kristi,
Yes.
how many nucs do you typically prepare in a given year, or when you overextended yourself?
Well, the year I overextended myself, I think I did 40.
Yeah,
I
was just curious.
Yeah. Typically now I may do around 15 to 20. And
Right.
honestly, I don't commit till late. I've already had some people contact me, and
Yeah.
I just say, no, let's just call me in March. I want to see what my bees look like.
Yeah.
Hey, Kristi, it's Vicki again. We have seen a lot of people commenting, particularly online, pros and cons, nucleus colonies over package bees. That's kind of almost a whole talk in and of itself. But could you just kind of briefly summarize what you feel like are the differences or I mean, I think each one of them has advantages, definitely, but I'd like your perspective.
Okay. Yeah, definitely each one has its own advantages and disadvantages. The thing I like about a package is typically when, especially a new beekeeper is starting out with a package, they're starting out with everything brand new. You know, new foundation, new frames, new hive bodies, new bees. And, you know, you can treat that package early on, especially for varroa mites, which is something I failed to talk about is treatments. I'll hit that after I'm done with this. But that's what I really like about packages. What I like about Nucs is that your queen is already accepted. She's laying. You've got brood of all ages in there. And it's, you know, it's an easy way to get started without some of the headaches of, you know, possible queen failure. The downside that I see to Nucs is, you know, when you're getting those 4 to 5 frames of bees and some of them with brood on it, you know, at least 3 or 4 of them are going to have brood on them typically. You're also inheriting any problems that that hive has, whether it be a virus or, you know, damaged comb, you know, not perfect comb. So that's the big downside I see of a nuke. The downside of a package I see is that at first when you install it, it starts out slow. In fact, it even goes a little bit backwards before it goes forwards, and it doesn't take off and grow as quickly. So
Cost can be the other one, but that's something that's pretty easy to compare. But thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. You got a few questions in the chat box, I think.
I forgot to talk about mite treatments for you. My philosophy is you want to do a mite treatment on your parent hives early on, and you want to let your customers know what your mite treatment strategies have been, so they'll know how to treat that nuke as the season moves along. So let's see if I can pull up the chat box and see what's being said.
Or do you want me to read them to you? It's up to you.
Yeah, why don't you do that so you can keep track?
Okay. Have you ever tried to produce nukes mid to late season to overwinter them? And does this work at all in Kansas?
No, I've never tried late season nukes, not intentionally. I mean, I just don't feel like, for the way I manage my bees, that's a good way for me to make nukes.
That's good. And when we sell nukes, we want to make sure they have a new queen in them, and an overwintered nuke would have an old queen a year before a queen in. Is that fair? So what's a good price for selling?
I think last year I sold mine for around 180. I was talking to someone earlier this week and they're selling theirs, I believe they said, for 210. I believe you should sell a nuke at a minimum the same cost as what packages are going for, but really that's too cheap. You should be above the price of what a package of bees is selling for, because there's a lot more work. And there's, you know, you're giving up some frames that you're going to have to replace.
I saw that Omaha was selling them for about 150 to 155, and that's
cheap.
That's really cheap. I mean, that's less than what a lot of the packages are going for around here. So Jackie Campbell says, so for 15 to 20 nucs a year that you're making? How many colonies are you running?
I have anywhere from 30 to 40 hives. And some of my nucs, I'm making up lost colonies, so I'm not selling all of them. The 15 to 20 is what I sell each year.
And do you prefer Georgia queens, California queens, or from where and why?
Actually, I've had queens from Georgia, California, Texas. I just want a good mated queen. I want the queen that's coming from the part of the state that has the best weather in the spring, which that's really hard to guess.
Especially when you have to guess in January. So then how do you do your marketing? Did it take time to develop a reputation as a nuke seller? And do you ever have trouble moving all the nukes you make?
I don't do any advertising. It's just word of mouth. And also I mentor a lot of new beekeepers. So that gives me a lot of word of mouth advertising. I forgot the second part of the question.
Do you have trouble selling them all?
No, I never have problems selling them all. If I've got something that I can't sell, I mean, you can put an ad on Facebook Marketplace pretty easy, Craigslist, that next door neighbor app. You can get rid of them pretty quick. And a lot of times, well, like here in the Kansas City area, there's Jordy's Honey. He might have someone that's looking for some bees. Jolie and Cecil might know somebody. I mean, so they're easy to get rid of.
Well, this next question brings up next month's program, and that Cheryl Burkhead, who was just on here a minute ago talking, is giving a presentation on raising your own queens. So that'll be the third Thursday next month. But this is your question, Kristi. Do you or have you ever considered grafting and raising your own queens?
Yes. I have grafted and raised queens once. I had a lot of fun doing it. It was a ton of work for my schedule because I do shift work, and sometimes it's just hard to get out there to do the things I need to do on a timely basis. Then about 5 or 6 years ago, I used the Jenner system and raised some queens successfully. The Jenner system's a little easier in that you're not grafting, and my eyesight isn't as good as it once used to be. I'm sounding like those old beekeepers I used to listen to 30 years ago. So I really like the Jenner system. John Speckman coached me up when I used it the first year, and I've used it about 3 times. But my main problem was I had to have my mating yard so far out because I live, in Olathe in the suburbs. And I wanted my mating yards more out in the country where I had more hives, and there were more hives around of other beekeepers. Is that my travel time got in the way when they were in the mating nucs. So my plan is, once I'm retired, maybe I'll try raising queens later on. But if I'm gonna mate queens, I'm not gonna have nucs as early. And a lot of times I feel by the time we have mated queens that we've raised ourselves, that's when our bees are already swarming. And so I feel like you're kind of behind the game if you're raising queens to split your hives, even if it's just from a swarm management perspective.
Good point. And can you name the sources you use for mated queens?
I've used Hikums out of California before. I used Vidalia queens before out of Georgia. I've used Minnesota hygienic queens before that. I went in, from Daryl Roofer. I mean, I've used lots of different sources for queens. I've used, oh, they're out of Georgia. Spell Bee Company, I think is what it is. Only that might not be their name anymore. I think they have a different name. So, I mean, in my mind, buying mated queens, I like to try and order from different parts of the United States because, you know, 1 year California queens might be great, you know, because their weather conditions are great for mating. And Georgia queens aren't good because they had rainy, cold weather. And so, you know, the drones didn't get out to mate with the virgin queens. And then the next year it might be vice versa. So that's why I like to try and get queens from at least 2 different sources. And a lot of times I go in with other beekeepers and get queens with them. I mean, there's been times when 2 or 3 of us have gone together and gotten, you know, 100 queens and split them among ourselves.
Another question. I am in Missouri. I am thinking to buy queens for the first round and then start raising some and use my own a little later. Just starting to sell nukes this year. Do you have any comments?
I guess my only comment would be is, you know, take some brood from all your hives. Don't save the last 20 or whatever to use for the queens you raise yourself, because they might be hanging in the trees by the time your queens get mated. So maybe break them, you know, set them back a little bit so that they do have some brood when you're ready to make your nuke or your split, when you do get your young mated queens that you raised.
She says she's agreeing with that, and thank you for answering. So far, that's all I have in the chat box. If anyone else has any questions. Oh, do you offer a guarantee on your nuke?
Not really. I mean, if it's turns out to be something really weird, yeah, I'll work with the customer, but you know, I don't, once the nuke leaves my premises, and that's part of the reason I go through every frame with the customer when they come to pick it up. I show them what's in there. And actually, I've never had anybody come back and say, man, you sold me a, you know, a lump of coal. I'll never buy a nuke from you again. But, you know, if there was some kind of circumstance where something was really off, you know, I'll work with the customer. And one thing I forgot to mention that I was going to mention is when I'm making my nukes, when I have all my frames of brood gathered, I feel like the sooner I can get that queen in my nuke, the better off I am with acceptance. I don't wait 24 hours to get that queen with those bees and brood.
That's good. Yeah, we're the same way. We really like to put our queen in right away, and I think it helps with queen acceptance. So another question, do you prefer 4 or 5 frame nukes and why?
I don't know as if I really prefer one over the other. I mean, I let them start out as 4 frame and sometimes they grow into 5. Especially when I used division board feeders, I always did 4 frame nukes because your division board feeder took up the place of a frame. But either or is fine. You know, and you just charge accordingly to whether, you know, how many frames of brood you're selling.
And then do you worry about people coming and knowing where your bees are?
Actually, when I have a lot of my nukes are just right here in my backyard, that kind of ends up being my nuke yard. And so I'm not worried about people coming to the house and getting them. generally I don't take people to the bee yard anyway. So if it's an out yard.
Do you find queen acceptance easier with a nuke than a full-size colony? Good question.
It's much easier with a nuke. There's less bees in there. Especially when you make nukes like I do, when you're making up your nukes with bees from several different hives, because there's no guarantee that, you know, the 3 or 4 frames of brood you put in that nuke box are all from the same colony. You know, those bees are kind of disillusioned, confused, and demoralized. And they know they're queenless, so sticking a new queen into that smaller group of bees, I feel you get a lot better acceptance than if you're trying to requeen a full-size colony with 20 frames in it. And even if you've just split that hive, you still got way more bees in there than you do a nuke, because typically you're making your splits, you know, in the middle of the day when it's full sun and a lot of that field force is gone. And a lot of times I'll even make a small nuke to requeen a full-size hive with, just because queen acceptance is easier. And then I'll go back, kill the queen in the full-size hive, and introduce the nuke.
Okay. Do you transport your nukes open? Great talk, Kristi.
Yes and no. If it's, you know, dusk, I'll leave them open. If it's still dark outside, you know, right before dawn, I'll leave them open. But, you know, if it's going to be, you know, if the sun's coming up to where it's, you know, the day's really beginning, I'll go ahead and put some hardware cloth in the opening. That way they still have some ventilation.
Well, the next person is obviously someone not from Kansas. Do you have your nukes inspected by the state inspector before you sell them? You go, girl.
Yeah, we don't have a state inspector. We've got other beekeepers, you know, good beekeepers. If you felt you had a problem, you know, if I have an issue, I'll get with another beekeeper and, you know, take pictures. But as far as an inspector, there's no inspection process in Kansas.
Yeah, Kansas is one of the few states we don't have apiary specialists that through extension that has anything to do with honeybees, nor do we haven't had a state bee inspector for, gosh, over 15 years, I'd say.
At least.
Easily, yeah. Well, Kristi, there were a lot of thank yous and good jobs and great stuff. So you really, I think you've hit most everything tonight. So
Kristi, I want to thank you for doing this for the Kansas Honey Producers and for all of us. I think that this last comment about the apiary inspector brings up a great point. Anybody can sell a nuke. Nearly anybody can sell packages. What makes the difference here in Kansas? What can you do? You better do your research. And you know what? Reputation is everything. So when somebody comes and asks me, who would I buy a nuke from? And I give you a name, it's because I know that person and I trust that person and I would buy a nuke from that person. And I try not to say bad things about people online. I try just to say good things about other people online. So if we're recommending somebody, that's because they've done a good job. And I would not hesitate to buy a nuke from Kristi. I wouldn't hesitate to buy one from our guest speaker next month, Cheryl Burkhead. She also sells and makes nukes and does an excellent job of it. So thanks again, Chris. Reputation is everything, and you got it, girl.
Well, thank you.
very good. So if anyone has suggestions for future topics, we have them planned out, I think, through April or May, but this has been so popular, we think we'll kind of keep it going. So if you have something you'd like to hear about, we'd really be interested in hearing your thoughts. You can email Kristi or I, or Facebook us or something like that. So that'd be great. Anyway, well, thanks everyone. And that's all I have. Kristi, any last words?
No, not really. Thanks for coming. I appreciated you all letting me share with you.
Good job. Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristi. Very good job.
You're welcome.